Okay. So this chapter, chapter 25, is really in many ways a continuation of chapter 24 and just expands on many of the concepts that we cover in chapter 24. And the reason that we cover, hold on a moment, the reason we have a chapter entirely devoted to fluids and electrolytes is just because of the critical role that these fluids and the critical role that electrolytes play in maintaining homeostasis of the body, right? So before we get into some of the nitty gritty details, I just want to go over some fun facts, if you will, when it comes to body fluids. So the human body itself is anywhere between 45 and 75% fluid. That fluid is made up primarily of water, and you can see it's a relatively large variation in percentages. And so there are some important factors that dictate how much of us is made up of fluid. So, for example, age. Infants have the highest percentage of fluid. They are made up of the highest percentage of fluid. In part, that's an adaptive mechanism to help to prevent them from becoming dehydrated. Um, on the opposite end of the spectrum, as we age, we become made up less and less of fluid. Part of that is due to the fact that adipose tissue makes up much less water than skeletal muscle does, and as we age, we lose a lot of skeletal muscle, and so that naturally is going to drop our percentage. And then for, once we get into childhood through adolescence and then through being, quote unquote, middle aged, that percentage kind of falls right in the middle, usually around, 60% or so. There's also a difference between the genders. So men tend to be made up of more fluid than women. That also is likely tied to the skeletal muscle issue, which is that, again, skeletal muscle is made up of, or another word to think about it, it retains much more water than fat tissue does. So skeletal muscle is made up of about 75% water, where fat or adipose tissue is made up of only about 20. And so as we lose skeletal muscle, and if we replace that skeletal muscle essentially with adipose tissue, we become made up of less and less water. And the effect that that has, amongst other things, is to make us very susceptible to dehydration, right? Which we'll talk about dehydration as one of the homeostatic imbalances coming up here. Okay, so the fluid in our body, again, you can think of the fluid as being made up mostly of water and electrolytes, right? But the fluid in our body is found in two different compartments, right? We have what is called intracellular fluid. We've talked about this in 227 when we were studying the cytosol, right? Um, about 2/3 of the total fluid in our body is intracellular, so is the fluid that you would find that makes up the cytosol. And then the other third is what we call the extracellular fluid. And the extracellular fluid is made up of two main things. It's made up of the interstitial fluid, which we've talked about, right? This is the fluid that you find outside of cells and also outside of the circulatory system. So this is the fluid that you find basically between the cells and the circulatory system, the vessels. It's not in the vessels, so it's not considered a part of the circulatory system. It's kind of the fluid that bathes our cells. And then the other main type of extracellular fluid that we have is the plasma that makes up the largest component of blood. So this is separated from the intracellular fluid, obviously by being captured in vessels. And then we also have other specific types of extracellular fluids that are just a little bit less as far as the overall percentage that they contribute are less, but nevertheless very important fluids. So fluids such as cerebral spinal fluid, the humors of the eye, the aqueous and vitreous humors of the eye, the serous fluids that we find, in the serous cavities, fluids in the inner ear, synovial fluid. All of those are examples of other types of extracellular fluids that contribute to this, the 1/3 that we find that makes up the total fluid of our body. Okay, apologize. I'm drinking coffee while I'm talking to you guys, so I hope it's not getting picked up too much on the speakers. Um, so when it comes to electrolytes, a lot of this information, or I should say all of this information at this point, should be familiar because we start talking about it kind of right out of the gate in 227, right? There are differences in the chemical concentrations for electrolytes when we talk about the inside of the cell within the intracellular fluid and the outside of the cell, the extracellular fluid, right? So we know that, for example, sodium is found in highest concentrations in the extracellular fluid, right? Outside of the cell as compared to inside of the cell. Um, Sodium, and I'll say this again when we get there, but sodium, when it comes to the way in which our body determines if we are dehydrated, or by the body, I mean the brain, and regulates hormones that will change that volume, that blood volume, the amount of fluid in our blood. Sodium is I mean, you can just jot down sodium is the most important ion when it comes to determining, um, making that determination by our nervous system. And it's because the body uses osmolarity, right? So sodium is such a common ion that, and it's such an important ion that when sodium levels go up, that's an indication to, within the blood, I mean, that's an indication to our body, therefore increasing osmolarity. That's an indication to our body that we are dehydrated. When sodium levels drop, that's an indication to the body that um, that we are either that sodium is either too diluted and or there's just not been enough sodium intake. And like I said, more on that to come. So sodium is very, very important when it comes to an ion that you find in the extracellular fluid. Excuse me. Another very important ion, and actually the one you find in highest abundance in the extracellular fluid, is chloride. It's the most important. I shouldn't. It's sorry. It's not the most important ion. It's the most abundant anion, so negatively charged ion within the extracellular fluid. And then when it comes to intracellular electrolytes that we've discussed, we talk about potassium, right? So much higher concentrations of potassium in the cell in the intracellular fluid than found in the outside. Magnesium and phosphate are also important ions that we find within the cell. And then in addition to that, we have, of course, larger size negatively charged proteins that are trapped within the cell that help to bring the charge of the membrane when the cell is at rest into that negative value. And then, of course, we have other adaptations for electrically capable cells that have really low resting membrane potentials. Okay, so when we talk about those different compartments, right, the intracellular compartment and then the extracellular compartment made up of blood plasma and the interstitial fluid, we have fluids or water that is moving constantly between cells into the interstitial space, back into the blood, depending on the how concentrated our blood is, right? And that's where this concept of osmolarity comes in. So osmolarity is the concentration of it's, so if you can remember again, kind of back to 227, think of osmoles as individual particles. So when we measure osmolarity, we are measuring the number of individual particles in the blood, right? So ions, when they dissociate, let's say sodium chloride, for example, right? Which is table salt without the iodine, but you could even use iodized salt as an example. When iodized salt dissociates in solution, which is what blood is, you go from one molecule of the sodium chloride iodine, right, to now three different ions when it dissociates in water: the sodium, the chloride, and the ion. Sorry, the sodium, the chloride, and the iodide. Right. So salt will increase the osmolarity of the blood very, very quickly. Um, other it's again because it contributes three ions. Other ions will other substances, non-ionic substances. So let's take glucose for example, right? Glucose, when you put glucose or table sugar in water, um, it does not disassociate, right? It can form a hydration shell, which is why it's able to dissolve because it's a very polar molecule, but it's not an ionic. It's not held together by ionic bonds that break, and so you'll have an increase in blood osmolarity. When we talk about molecule for molecule, will happen much faster with salt than it will, for example, with glucose. And what happens when we, let's say, eat a meal that is very, very high in salt, is that salt, of course, gets absorbed into the blood, and as it moves through the kidney, it gets filtered at the level of the renal corpuscle. As we discussed when we were in chapter 24, all of that, for the vast majority of that, up to 98% of that, is reclaimed um, at the level of the nephron. However, when we talked about renal clearance and transport maximum, right, there is a critical level within the blood at which you will just start to spill sodium into your urine because you don't need any more systemic sodium. You don't need any more in your blood. Um, and so that's when you'll start to spill large amounts of sodium into your urine. And it's also the point at which you would find your blood would have a high osmolarity, right? It would be very concentrated. In response to that, because of the process or the principle of osmosis, right? Um, you will well A couple of things will happen. Having that very high osmolarity with sodium will trigger the hypothalamus to secrete more ADH, and that allows you to pull, as we know, more water from what would become urine back into the blood to hopefully dilute the urine. But the other thing that would happen is that you would end up your cells, because you would be placing cells in um, a hypertonic environment, basically, or next to a hypertonic environment, the fluid from within the cells will leave and move from high to low, right? So where there's going to be a lot of particles, right, where there's going to be a lot of salt, there's going to be not a lot of room for water. It's kind of a simple way to think of it. And so if you have, again, this very, very diet that's very, very high in salt, and so you maxed out your renal clearance, and it's your blood is relatively concentrated or relatively hypertonic, what will happen is you will dehydrate your cells. So the water will get pulled from the cells and into the blood, because again, it's going to move from an area of high to low. Oh, one last thing I'll say on this side. And then, of course, when we drink water, water is going to rehydrate the body. When you drink water, which you will be triggered to drink water by the brain, when you reach this critical mass, if you will, of solute concentration within the blood. And then when you drink that water, you make the blood more, closer to isotonic, right? Because there's been a disruption over here. So you bring the blood closer to isotonic. And then, of course, water, as always, will move from high to low. So now you're going to have a situation in which you have more water that's coming here. Most of the water has left the cells because you were dehydrated. And so now it's going to move from an area of high concentration. I'm toggling between these two because I'm talking about concepts from both. From high water concentration to low, and it'll rehydrate the cells. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the factors that influence fluid balances in the body, and some important concepts that kind of belie this. The first one is relatively, I think, intuitive, which is that in order to be balanced, fluid intake has to equal fluid output, right? And there are different types of fluid output that exist and different types of fluid intake that exist that we're going to talk about. In addition to that, when we are balanced, we have normal distribution of water. So basically normal tonicity in the compartments. So within the intracellular compartments, and the extracellular fluids, right? And so you're not getting a net movement of water in either direction. And we have lots of different systems that are there to help maintain fluid homeostasis, right? And we'll talk about those. And most of these we've already actually touched on in some shape, form, or fashion, the hormones, for example. So we'll be going through some of the systems that we have in place to help us maintain homeostasis. Okay, so as promised, we are going to discuss different types of fluid intake and output. Okay, so when we talk about fluid intake, right, this is the fluid that we bring into the body every day. The normal value for this is about 2,500 mils per day, right? Of course, fluid intake has to equal fluid output, so the normal loss is also 2,500 per day. Um, and main ways in which we take in fluids. So of course, there's ingested water, right? It's also called preformed water. Ingested water is the water that we get from the substances that we take in intentionally to our body. So from the water that we drink or the fluids that we drink, you know, other fluids such as juice, of course, are going to have water too. Even soda, although it's terrible for you, will have water. So from any fluid that we drink and any food that we eat, we are able to, if that if the fluid that we if the food and the fluids that foods that we are eating and fluids that we are drinking um, fall within, they're not incredibly salty or dehydrated or et cetera, we're able to get about 23 um 2,300 mils per day. This of course is the easiest way to adjust your fluid intake, is to control specifically really the amount of fluids that you take in, and even more specifically than that, the amount of water. And then there's also about 200 mils that is made through what we call metabolic water. So this is the water that is produced as our cells undergo aerobic cellular respiration. And during that process, of course, there are a lot of dehydration syntheses that occur. And when a dehydration synthesis occurs, right? And dehydration syntheses would be putting together molecules, forming bonds. Water is lost in the process. Okay. And then when it comes to fluid out, balancing that intake with output, we have fluid that is lost through just the regular activities that happen as we go through the day. So as we move around and our body temperature increases, we sweat. We lose some water just because it evaporates through the skin. Breathing, when we breathe, of course, the humid air that we are breathing out, there is water vapor in that air. We lose water that way. About 60% of the water that we lose is through urination. So that's obviously more than half. And we'll talk about ways in which our body regulates urination to control fluid output. And then we're going to talk about water loss in terms of basically we have four different definitions that we can use to describe water loss, right? So we have sensible and versus insensible, and then obligatory versus facultative. Okay. So this is a picture from your textbook that I think does a pretty good job at helping summarize these different ways in which we describe water loss. So sensible water loss, when you think of sensible water loss, think of not primarily, but largely urination, right? So urination it's a measurable type of water loss. If you go into a clinical environment and they are monitoring your the functioning of your kidneys, measuring fluid output by measuring sensible water loss is the main way in which, or one of the main ways in which kidney functioning is, and fluid balance in the body is measured. Liver failure would be the same thing. Your fluid output is measured and regulated very closely to make sure that your intake doesn't exceed output. We also do lose a little bit of there's also some sensible water loss that occurs through the production of feces. It's quite a bit less, obviously, it's about 200 mils versus 1500 mils, more or less. And then, in addition to sensible water loss, we have a type of water loss that is not measurable, and it is called insensible. So, this is the kind of water that you lose in water vapor as you're breathing, or as you're sweating, or again through your skin. Okay. And then we talk about fluid loss as either being obligatory or facultative. So, obligatory water loss is water loss that happens constantly, right? So, when we were just a moment ago talking about insensible water loss as the immeasurable type of water loss that we get like through breathing. Breathing would be both obligatory and insensible, right? We lose that water loss. Um, it's happening all the time just as we breathe. Um, Another example of obligatory water loss would be water that is lost through feces or through the little bit of urine that is produced even when we are incredibly dehydrated, right? Urine is produced not only to help balance the fluids of the body, but also as a necessary process to filter the blood and get rid of waste, like the nitrogenous waste, right? So if we are so dehydrated that we are not urinating at all, um, one of the risks that we start to run into, or the problems we start to run into, is that you get this buildup of nitrogenous waste products, for example, in the blood. Um, I should mention that in general, animals, and we are no exception to this, do not tolerate water loss well at all. So we don't survive if there's no water intake. We do not survive long. I want to say, on average, maybe 4 to 5 days um, with absolutely no water loss. I'm sorry, no water intake. Um, we just, yeah, we don't. It might be a bit longer than that, but it's not much. We just don't do well with no when we don't take in fluids. And then facultative, obligatory water loss is different from, or can be differentiated from facultative water loss, and that facultative is controlled, right? So facultative water loss is the kind of water loss that you think of that fluctuates wildly based on how much water you're drinking, right? So if you're drinking a lot of water, um, that information is fed to the brain, and hormone levels are regulated in response to that, in addition to the fact that, of course, your bladder will fill up faster, so you urinate more frequently. Facultative water loss is the only mechanism that we have to control fluid output, right? And it's the control part that's important there. It doesn't, of course, mean it's the only type, it's the only mechanism involved with fluid output, but it's the only mechanism that we have that allows us to control our hydration status, right? This uh, the sense that we have in the reflexes that are involved in urination would fall under facultative processes that contribute to facultative water loss. Okay, so when it comes to homeostatic imbalances with fluid, right? On a very basic way to think of it is that we end up with fluid imbalances anytime our output is not the same as our intake, right? There are different types of homeostatic imbalances, fluid imbalances that exist. So, and we're going to go through them. We have volume depletion, volume excess, dehydration, hypotonic hydration, which is just a fancy word for water toxicity, and what we call fluid sequestration. Um, you know, different examples of this would be, you can kind of make a note, edema, right, as a type of fluid sequestration. Okay. And then a couple things to keep in mind, or questions to always think about as you're trying to remember the differences between these different types of fluid, these different fluid imbalances, is to think about whether or not the fluid, that fluid imbalance changes the osmolarity of the fluid, and then whether or not that fluid imbalance is called by an excess or a deficiency of body fluids, right? Okay, so imbalances that occur that do not change osmolarity would be the two that we're going to talk about are volume depletion and volume excess. Okay, so let me say that again. Depletion and excess, these are two imbalances that occur that do not change the osmolarity of the blood, right? Or of the fluid itself is isotonic, that's gained or lost. So an example of something that would lead to volume excess, right, would be a tumor or for whatever reason, something that causes an increase in the amount of aldosterone secreted from the adrenal glands. Okay, so aldosterone, if you can remember, aldosterone causes at the level of the kidney tubules and primarily in the convoluted tube that I'm sorry, the collecting tubules, it causes your body um, to reabsorb sodium, so to move sodium from what will become urine, what is almost urine, to move that sodium back into the blood, and then water will follow sodium, right? So when you get an excess, and there are lots of different conditions, adrenal gland um, issues and various cancers that can cause an increase in aldosterone secretion. But what happens with aldosterone secretion is you end up with fluid volume excess, but it's an isotonic kind of excess. So these are going to be individuals who don't end up with the one of the main problems that will come along with this will be a spike in blood pressure, because you're going to increase blood volume dramatically, which is going to increase blood pressure. But again, the change is isotonic, so you don't get a movement, a disruption in the compartments in which the fluid is held. All right. And then on the other end of that spectrum would be volume depletion. Um, volume depletion can occur in the opposite. So I was just talking about someone who is secreting too much, an abnormal amount of aldosterone. There are also conditions that can cause an individual to not secrete enough aldosterone, and those individuals can end up volume depleted. So dehydrated, volume depleted, because they don't have enough aldosterone around to tell that sodium to move back into the blood, and water will follow sodium. And of course, another symptom would be someone with a hyposecretion of aldosterone could end up with kind of these precipitous drops in blood pressure. Other ways in which volume depletion can occur would be somebody is severely burned, so they lose that cutaneous membrane that helps to prevent the evaporation of water. Chronic vomiting or diarrhea can lead to volume depletion. And then a condition we'll hopefully get to called metabolic alkalosis. And then also hemorrhaging, of course, just because if you're losing blood, you're losing your main source of water, because that is the main way in which water is found within the vessels. Okay. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we can have fluid imbalances that do have changes that come along with changes in osmolarity. So dehydration, the word dehydration is used to describe a loss of water that is greater than the loss of solutes within, and I'll just say within the fluid, but I always think of this primarily as being blood, right? So, you can get dehydration can occur because of, not of profuse sweating. It definitely can occur if you do anything that screws with the amount of antidiuretic hormone that is secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. And some ways, so if there's some tumor, for example, that's causing hyposecretion of ADH, that will make it so that you don't pull as much water as you normally would, and the amount of water that you should to stay hydrated back into the blood. Alcohol consumption, so excess alcohol consumption One of the side effects of alcohol is to essentially tell the, pardon me, to tell the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus that not as much ADH, that the body is more hydrated than it really is. So the body starts to get a hyposecretion of ADH with alcohol consumption, and what that can result in is the production of you, or you producing as the person who had too much alcohol, copious amounts of very dilute urine, and it kind of tricks your body into thinking you are more hydrated than you are. And so then you wake up very dehydrated. Of course, just not drinking enough um, will result in not having enough water in the blood. Um, and what happens with dehydration and the risk that we run is just like what we were looking at several moments ago when we were on that side where you saw the cell. In fact, I can back up to it right here. So what happens is that when we become dehydrated, our blood becomes hypertonic, and then you'll have intracellular fluid that will leave the cells and go into the blood in order to help maintain or reestablish homeostasis. And the cells themselves become, they can undergo crenation, which is that kind of shrinking or shriveling and ultimately death of the cells. Let me go back to where I was. All right. And then hypotonic hydration. So, hypotonic hydration, like I said, is also called water toxicity, right? What happens with the things that can cause water toxicity can range anywhere from there being a problem, an endocrine issue. So having too much ADH around, right? So in that event, if your posterior pituitary is secreting too much ADH, your body will pull too much water from what would become urine back into the blood, and you will make your blood hypotonic. Another thing that can cause water toxicity is if somebody drinks large amounts of water. And that could be because, let's say you're running, you're an ultra marathon runner and you're running 100 miles, right? Um, so you're drinking water, of course, to stay hydrated because you're losing so much of it as you sweat. But if you're replacing, especially in an extreme situation like that where you're running 100 miles, if you're replacing only the water and not the electrolytes, and you're losing so many of those electrolytes through sweating and so much of that water through sweating, you can make yourself hypotonic. And there's some severe consequences for that we'll discuss in a moment. And then another, not common, but another way in which people become or experience water toxicity, or um, you know, they're kind of hazing rituals that sometimes people do when they go to college, and they're kind of forced, if you will, or people will dare them to drink a gallon of water every, I'm making this up, every, within 10 minutes. And if you do that, you will very quickly make yourself hypotonic. And the problem with one of the many problems with having your blood be hypotonic is that you cause your cells to swell. And I'm going to do this annoying backup here so we can see it, right? But if you make your blood hypotonic, that water is going to move from high to low, and it's going to move into your cells, and your cells will start to swell. And if the cells that do this are cells in your brain, you end up with a lot of issues. You can die. That's the toxicity from water toxicity, because you can cause so much swelling that you get hemorrhaging and seizure activity, and it's not a good thing. Okay, and then with fluid sequestration, so to sequester fluids just means that the fluid, the total volume of fluid in the body is normal, but the placement of the fluid is abnormal, right? So the fluid is not found in its normal compartments. For example, you'll find a lot with fluid sequestration, a lot of the fluid might be found in the interstitial space. So the interstitial fluid, that amount of fluid is much too high, right? So examples of fluid sequestration, of course, would be edema, which we see when we injure a tissue, um, and we disrupt the pressures that dictate water movement between the interstitial fluid and the blood, right? So edema is very common. Ascites is a type of fluid sequestration that is specifically associated with conditions like liver failure. It's a very noticeable, that's what you're seeing in this picture up here is ascites. It's an accumulation of fluid within the peritoneal cavity because of the lack of plasma proteins, because the liver is not functioning. Anyway, like I said, I just want you to know that fluid sequestration, there are different types of it, um, but it's just an abnormal distribution of water, even though the total amount of fluid in the body is normal. Okay, so what do I want to say on this side? So, as far as regulating the fluids in our body, right? We have different mechanisms in place um, to make sure that fluid balance is does stay within homeostatic range because it plays such an important role in keeping and maintaining homeostasis for the cardiovascular system, right? So when our blood volume is too high, we become hypertensive. If your blood volume is too low, you become hypotensive. Um, and we've already talked about the movement of fluids and how problematic that can be if homeostasis is not maintained. Okay, so from this slide, some of the mechanisms that help us regulate fluid intake, right? So we have, of course, nervous system stimulation. That nervous system component is what we call the thirst center, right? So the thirst center can be activated in several ways. So one of the most powerful stimulations for activating the thirst center is an increase in blood osmolarity, which we talked about, right? Um, the most common solute that is involved with activating the thirst center and stimulating or triggering the hypothalamus to make and then store. And just as a reminder, ADH is made by the hypothalamus and then it's stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. So I use kind of both terms interchangeably, as does your text. But one of the most powerful stimulants for having the hypothalamus make ADH is an increase in osmolarity, and that's most commonly due to an increase in sodium. Another thing that will stimulate the thirst center will be a decreased blood volume, right, and a drop in blood pressure. So, in that, in an example in which you're hemorrhaging, right, you've gotten into an accident, you're losing a lot of blood. Um, One of the things people will report is that they start to feel very, very thirsty. Same thing if somebody's blood pressure drops precipitously, um, they will report being very thirsty. One of the mechanisms in place we have to help combat that is an increase in the amount of renin that is secreted from the kidney, right? And this kind of ties back into when we were talking about the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And anyway, I kind of revisit that lecture if you don't remember the whole renin discussion. But renin is secreted from the kidney and then ultimately results in the production of angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 is what will ultimately stimulate or feed back to stimulate the thirst center and further make us thirsty. Angiotensin 2 also causes an increase in aldosterone and AGH secretion to hopefully increase blood volume. And it also causes peripheral vasoconstriction as an effort to increase blood pressure. And then decreased salivary secretions. Decreased salivary secretions also play a role in activating the thirst center. For what it's worth, it's this increase in blood osmolarity and a decrease in blood pressure and blood volume that are these are much more powerful stimulants for being thirsty, especially this increase in blood osmolarity than decreased salivary secretions. And then stimuli that turn off thirst center are going to kind of intuitively be in many ways the opposite of the things that turn them on. So a decrease in blood osmolarity will make it such that the hypothalamus is no longer stimulated to make ADH. An increase in blood volume or blood pressure will inhibit the release of renin from the kidney, and therefore a decrease in the amount of angiotensin 2 that is produced. Increased secretions, salivary secretions, also feedback and turn off thirst center. And then also we have baroreceptors that detect stretch in the stomach, that's caused by fluids entering, and those tend to also inhibit um, sensory, that they tend to inhibit the thirst center. Okay, so regulating fluid output, right? So we have 4 hormones, and this is all review, guys. So I'm just going to run through this pretty quickly. We have 4 hormones that play a really important role in regulating fluid levels in the body, and they're the same 4 hormones that play a really important role in regulating urine production, right? We have angiotensin 2, which angiotensin 2 is produced in response to renin being secreted from the kidneys. We have ADH from the hypothalamus / posterior pituitary gland. We have aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, right? And then we have atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, which is the 4th hormone that kind of counteracts, it's the antagonist to the first 3. So the first 3, angiotensin, ADH, and aldosterone, they will result in less urine production, right? And that makes sense. Those hormones are there to help control, to increase blood pressure, and to increase blood volume, right? And to maintain hydration status within the blood. And so when you have these hormones around, you're going to make less urine. You're going to be wasting, if you will, less water in the urine. ANP is produced within the atria of the heart. And ANP is an important hormone the cardiovascular system uses to help decrease blood pressure. So in the presence of ANP, urine volume goes up, right? And having more of that, having more urine be produced, implies that more water is being moved from the blood into the urine, which will help to decrease blood volume, therefore decreasing blood pressure. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these slides. Let me see where I am time-wise. Could someone tell me what time it is? I don't have a watch. No. Oh, there's my phone. Okay. 9:45. Okay, we're okay. So I'm going to run through these slides pretty quickly and just kind of highlight the information I want you to take from them. So electrolytes versus non-electrolytes. We talked about this in 227. I still expect you to just have a basic understanding of how these the difference between these 2 terms. So electrolytes are substances that when they are put into solution, they are able to conduct electricity, right? When we talk about the salts, those are, and all of the charged ions that we have that we've talked about throughout the course of 227 and 228, all of those are electrolytes, right? And they play a very important role, as we know, in signal transduction, in maintaining the resting membrane potential, et cetera, right? And then non-electrolytes are molecules that do not dissociate, and so they're not able to conduct electricity, right? So one of the differences we discussed in 227 is we use glucose and table salt, right? Table sugar and table salt. Both sucrose and table salt will dissolve in water, but one is an electrolyte and the other one is not, right? Sucrose is not an electrolyte because it is a molecule that, although polar, and that's how it's able to dissolve in water, although polar, it is held together by covalent bonds. And so it's not a charged molecule when you put it into solution. With table salt, when you put it into water, table salt will dissociate into sodium and chloride. And both of those are ions, so they're able to conduct electricity. Okay, so sodium, again, most of what we've talked about, or most of what's on here, we have talked about already. Sodium is an incredibly important ion when it comes to again, maintaining the resting membrane potential and controlling electrical activity of cells. The vast majority of it is found outside of the cell, so in the extracellular fluid, right? It's the main positively charged ion in the extracellular fluid, otherwise known as a cation, right? And it exerts the greatest amount of osmotic pressure. Um, the amount of sodium that we lose in urine is regulated by aldosterone, as we know, also by ADH and also atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, and then hypertonic versus hypotonic. Um, we oftentimes those terms are based on the salt, the osmolarity of the blood that is a result of the sodium concentration. So if there's too much sodium in the blood becomes hypertonic. Not enough, it becomes hypotonic. Okay, potassium, the vast majority of potassium found inside of the cell, right? Um, Potassium has, I'm not going to ask you questions, but just by way of reminder, potassium levels are regulated because we have potassium leak channels. So potassium is always leaking out and then leaking out of the cells. And then we have the sodium potassium pump that is continually pumping 2 potassium in for every 3 potassium out, right? So those leak channels and the pumps help to establish and maintain those chemical concentration gradients for sodium and potassium inside and outside of the cell. So potassium is the principal cation. So we were talking about sodium being the main anion, right? I'm sorry. I'm like totally mincing my words. We were talking about sodium being the principal cation in the extracellular fluid. Potassium is the principal cation in the intracellular fluid. Okay. Just like sodium plays an absolutely critical role in regulating electrical activity within cells, the amount of, and as a result, levels of, and potassium, I should mention, plays the most important role. The range at which our bodies keep potassium within what's the word I'm using, trying to find the parameters for potassium are much more tightly regulated than any other ion in the body, right? And that's just because it doesn't take a large fluctuation in potassium to have very profound impacts on the electrical activity of electrically active cells, like cardiac muscle cells, for example. So the total amount of potassium that we have is pretty tightly regulated. Most of the potassium that we lose is lost in urine, right? So of course we lose more of it if the potassium levels in the blood get too high and out of range. The amount that we waste in the urine will of course go up. Aldosterone also. So again, remember aldosterone causes the reabsorption of sodium in the collecting tubules. At the same time, it's actually in high potassium levels in the blood are the most powerful stimulant for aldosterone secretion. So as aldosterone is causing us to reabsorb more sodium and pull it back into the blood, it also causes us to take potassium from the blood and dump it into the urine. Okay. So that's an important, that potassium being the most powerful stimulus for aldosterone secretion is an important point. Okay, and then other important ions, I'm going to go through this really quickly. Not that they're not important, but what essentially I want you to know. So chloride is often associated with sodium. It's going to be the most abundant anion, so negatively charged ion in the extracellular fluid. If we have levels that are too high, that's a condition called hyperchloremia. Too low, hypochloremia. Calcium, much of calcium is bound up in bone and teeth. Calcium, we already know the role that calcium plays in muscle contraction, how important it is. And so its levels within the blood are also tightly monitored. We've already talked about hormones involved with that when we were throughout the course really of the semester in 227 and 228 when we discussed parathyroid hormone and calcitriol. Um, those are both hormones that regulate the amount of calcium that is liberated in the blood because again, that range has to be tightly controlled. Having too much calcium in the blood results in a condition called hypercalcemia. Too little is hypocalcemia. These are can be very problematic conditions because of the ramifications of having really high or really low calcium levels on signal transduction and heart rate, right? And specifically cardiac muscle functioning. And then what I want you to know about phosphate and magnesium. So phosphate is the most abundant anion within the intracellular fluid. So it's kind of phosphate is to potassium what chloride is to sodium, right? Most of it is stored just like calcium in bone and teeth. Plays a really important role. The phosphate ion does as a buffer, right? An intracellular buffer. Magnesium I'm not going to ask you as much detail as the second most abundant, but just kind of so you know, it's the second most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid. Very important in a variety of different cellular functions and in muscle relaxation. That's really as much as I expect you to know. Okay. So, guys, with the hormones, as I said, most of this we have talked about and in pretty good detail when we were in the urinary system chapter. So you can use these slides to just to review these hormones and make sure that you're comfortable with where and how they are produced and then the effects that they have on urine production and the effects that they have on and any of kind of the downstream effects of that when it comes to regulation of blood pressure, right? By regulating blood volume. So renin is secreted from the juxtaglomerular apparatus, right? It's secreted. One of the main stimulants for that is a low blood pressure or also sympathetic stimulation. And then renin, along with angiotensin converting enzyme, converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And then what does angiotensin 2 do? It stimulates the thirst center, right? So you're going to drink more water. It causes vasoconstriction, which is going to increase the resistance, peripheral resistance, and increase blood pressure. It's going to decrease urine output because it's going to essentially cause vasoconstriction, cause not as much blood to flow into the kidney and get filtered. And then it's a very powerful stimulant for antidiuretic hormone. So it will stimulate antidiuretic hormone secretion from the posterior pituitary gland. It will stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. And both of those, of course, are going to increase blood volume by pulling more water into the blood. Okay, so ADH, we already know how ADH works, right? It increases the expression of aquaporins in areas where you don't typically get reabsorption. So the latter portion of the distal convoluted tubules, the collecting tubules, and the collecting ducts. I've already said this, but just by way of reminder, having a high osmolarity of the blood is a very powerful stimulant for antidiuretic hormone. Not just a very powerful, but it is the main stimulus for ADH release from the posterior pituitary gland. And then we've already talked about angiotensin 2. And yeah, and blood volume, and also a low blood volume, which is detected by having not a lot of stretch within the vessels and within the heart. Those are also stimuli for ADH secretion. Okay, so go over this. I've said all. I don't want to spend a lot of time saying things I've already said, but I think these pictures are also very valuable in helping you remember the effects that these hormones have, where they come from, and what they do, the effects they have on the body. Okay, so a couple clinical views. So diabetes insipidus. We've talked about diabetes mellitus in the past, right? um, which is diabetes due to an imbalance in insulin and ultimately the sugar, the amount of sugar that's in the blood and doesn't get taken up into the cells. Diabetes insipidus is uh, is a condition that can occur if you don't or if you're not making enough ADH, right? So if you're not making enough ADH, your blood volume is going to drop. You're going to um, and you're going to become well, you'll ultimately become dehydrated, right? That says I'm not going to test you on that. Okay. Aldosterone. Aldosterone, I expect you to know this. Again, all of this is stuff we've covered. So aldosterone, think adrenal cortex, think increasing the amount of sodium that is reabsorbed at the nephron level, and that water follows sodium. So you're going to increase blood volume, but in an isotonic way. And also think aldosterone as being equated to an increase in blood pressure because of that increase in blood volume. And then ANP, remember ANP is the hormone that antagonizes the hormones that we just discussed, right? And so ANP is going to have the opposite effect. It is secreted when the body detects an abnormal amount of stretch in the atria, which is indicative to the body that blood pressure is too high. And so ANP will make it so that more water is wasted, if you will, or is put into the urine, which will decrease blood volume and therefore decrease blood pressure. It also inhibits the release of those hormones that would counteract ANP and increase blood pressure. So it will decrease the secretion of aldosterone. It will decrease the secretion of ADH. It will decrease the secretion of renin from the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Again, think of it as the antagonist to the all of the other hormones that we've mentioned. Okay, so when it comes, I'm just going to kind of briefly run through what I want you to know when it comes to acids and bases and their relationship to uh, the fluid balance issue. So, as we know, because we've hammered this point over and over again, having a proper pH is absolutely essential to maintaining homeostasis, right? Our cells do not do well when we deviate much out of the range. And I'm using our cells as a general, I'm not taking into consideration cells that have special adaptations like those that are found in the stomach. In general, our body cells don't like um, to be in an environment where the pH deviates much out of the range of 7, right? Another reminder, pH is inversely related to the hydrogen ion concentration. So as we drop in the value of the pH below 7, so 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, that means there is a logarithmic increase in the number and the hydrogen ion concentration, right? So a pH of 4 versus a pH of 3, a pH of 3 will have 10 times as many hydrogen ions as a pH of 4, right? So we're increasing as we move down on the pH scale. And then conversely, as we move up, we decrease the amount of hydrogen ions above a pH of 8, okay? We have 2 types of acids that we find in the body, and I do want you to be able to differentiate between them. So we have what's called fixed acid, right? So fixed acid is produced from metabolic processes, so for example, when people go into ketoacidosis, if they're on the keto diet, right, which is a diet which is very, very high in fat, not so much in protein, but higher in protein, but very low in carbohydrates. And what happens when carbohydrates are not around is that the body will use other sources to make energy, other macromolecules, and very efficiently it will start to metabolize fat and use fat to essentially as a replacement for the polysaccharides or the carbohydrates that were being consumed. But that's not at the it's not at the what I'm saying. It is at the expense of the kidneys to some degree. So keto acids that result in ketoacidosis, that's a type of fixed acid. Lactic acid from glycolysis, that's a type of fixed acid. Fixed acids are regulated by the kidney, right? So when we talk about fixed acids, we're going to talk about these terms metabolic and respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. So fixed acids, which are again regulated by the kidney, those are the kind of acids that are that we see that contribute to metabolic acidosis, right? And then we have what are called volatile acids. So volatile acids are different from fixed in that they basically come from carbonic acid, right? That's the easiest way to think about them. So carbonic acid is a weak acid right here, right? H2CO3. And carbonic acid is kind of the intermediary in this pathway by which our bodies are able to take CO2 produced from cellular, a waste product from cellular metabolism, combine it with water, make carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion and bicarb, right? And as long as we have carbonic anhydrase as the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction, okay? Um, the reason we call the kinds of the hydrogen ions that are produced from carbonic acid, and the reason we call carbonic acid a volatile acid, is because it is made from a gas, right? So this gas CO2 is typically the gas. This is what we blow out when we exhale. Um, Again, because it's a waste product of cellular metabolism. And as such, volatile acids are regulated by the respiratory system, right? So we talked about this a bit when we were in respiration. The faster that you breathe, if you hyperventilate, for example, one of the things that can happen is that you pass out. And the reason you pass out is because one of the most important stimulus for breathing is an accumulation in CO2 within the blood. And when you breathe out, and therefore in a decrease in blood pH. So when you hyperventilate, you breathe out CO2 too quickly. And what will happen is you will decrease the doing so. That's the body's way of trying or one of the body's ways in which the body is trying to decrease or increase the pH, decrease the hydrogen ion concentration. It's trying to decrease the amount of CO2 that's available to form carbonic acid and then to liberate hydrogen ions. And again, kind of keep that in mind because when we get to, which I'm about to just skip to these slides because I want to get to them, to metabolic and respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, it all kind of makes sense. Okay, so you can go through, we've talked about all of these concepts when it comes to how the body regulates acids, hydrogen ion substances that liberate hydrogen ions and bases, right? When it comes to the kidneys and how it's the latter portion of the renal tubules, so within the distal convoluted tubules and collecting tubules and collecting ducts, that hydrogen and bicarb levels are regulated. So make sure you go through and read that if you don't remember that information from the urinary system. Okay, and then here's kind of the deal with respiratory acidosis and alkalosis and metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, right? So, and again, all of this is stuff that we have covered at some point between the respiratory system and now. So when the body is at rest, right, we are breathing at a rate that gets rid of CO2 and maintains blood pH. Because if we breathe too slowly or we retain CO2, we become acidotic. All right. And that's because, again, of the reaction by which CO2 combines with water to make carbonic acid and liberates hydrogen ions. Okay. And then we've already talked about how CO2 is the most important, most powerful stimulus for respiration and all of that. Okay. And as such, when we are in a state, when everything's working well with our bodies, respiration doesn't typically, the amount that we're breathing isn't contributing significantly to blood pH, just because think of respiration as being altered to change blood pH as a compensatory mechanism. It's typically not needed, I guess is what I should say. Okay. And it's not needed. Different buffering systems. Again, we've talked about this before in the body. These are systems in place to help maintain blood pH, so to prevent changes in blood pH, right? So proteins act as buffers that are really important. Um, we have phosphate in the intercellular fluid that we've talked about. That is a very important buffer. And then, of course, bicarb, which is the most important buffering system that we have in our extracellular fluids that we've talked a ton about from the beginning of this class through the end. Bicarb plays in a an essential role um, in maintaining blood pH. Okay, so these are 4 categories of acid-base disturbances I want you to know. Okay, so we can either be acidotic or we can be alkalotic, and it can fall into one of two categories: respiratory or metabolic. Okay, the type of whether or not we're having respiratory versus metabolic acidosis or alkalosis is going to depend on whether or not the disturbance in pH is due to a respiratory issue or a metabolic issue, right? Basically, due to a change in the volatile acid or the fixed acid concentration, because fixed acids will be the one kind of regulated by the kidneys, right? And then the volatile acids will, carbonic acid is regulated by the respiratory rate. Okay. So things that cause, so respiratory acidosis, probably the most common cause of respiratory acidosis, um, or the most acute cause, I should say, of respiratory acidosis would be hypoventilation, right? So if you don't breathe enough, you're accumulating CO2. CO2 will turn into carbonic acid, and you'll decrease the pH of the blood, right? We also have CO2 retainers. We talked about people with COPD, like emphysema, who are unable, because of changes within their lungs, unable to exhale the amount of CO2 that they need to maintain homeostasis, and they also end up retaining too much CO2 and becoming acidotic. So anything that blocks the ability of air to leave the lungs is going to ultimately lead to an accumulation of CO2 in the body and make an individual acidotic. Okay. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have respiratory alkalosis, right? So, and the values, I don't care that you necessarily know, but I do expect if you see PCO2, that should remind you that we're talking about the partial pressure of CO2, right? Partial pressures are how we measure the amount of a gas in the air that we breathe. So your brain should automatically go to respiratory. Hopefully that makes sense. So respiratory alkalosis, um, most common cause is just somebody hyperventilating. So anxiety, fear, um, hypoxia. So if somebody is, um, you know, climbing to the, above 14,000 feet, um, that will make it so that there's insufficient, it disrupts the PCO2, PO2, all of those levels, and can lead to hypoxia, and ultimately respiratory alkalosis. And then interesting, an overdose in aspirin is another thing that can stimulate the respiratory system and cause somebody to start breathing too quickly and cause respiratory alkalosis. And then metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. This is going to happen when there are disruptions in bicarb and hydrogen ions that are regulated at the level of the kidneys, right? So, and the same concept is there as far as if you get an accumulation. So if you get an accumulation of hydrogen ions, as you would see when somebody is in ketoacidosis, um, you can see that excessive alcohol intake leads to the production of too much acetic acid, right? That will drop the pH of the blood. If the kidneys fail, then the kidneys become less capable of regulating the amount of hydrogen that is secreted into the urine. That can cause a disruption or can cause somebody to become acidotic. And then also if somebody becomes, so when we talk about vomiting and diarrhea, right? Vomiting and diarrhea are two important homeostatic imbalances that cause metabolic disturbances, right? So if somebody has is struggling with emesis, so is vomiting profusely for long periods of time, we worry about those individuals ending up with very commonly metabolic alkalosis, right? And I should say that vomiting and diarrhea can cause really, they just can cause metabolic disturbances. So most commonly vomiting will result in metabolic alkalosis or diarrhea, because of the elimination of bicarb in the diarrhea, um, will lead to metabolic acidosis. But both of these will cause metabolic disturbances, vomiting and diarrhea, if not treated. Um, and then when it comes to, don't worry about this slide, when it comes to compensation, we know the ways in which the kidneys compensate when it comes to type A versus type B cells. So just review that information if you don't remember it. And then respiratory compensation can occur from metabolic disturbances and vice versa, right? So if somebody has metabolic acidosis, one thing you will start to see is that that person's respiratory rate um, will change, right? So if somebody has metabolic acidosis, their respiratory rate will increase in order to compensate for that. I apologize for that decrease in pH and those excess hydrogen ions that are around. And let me put my dog out so you have to listen to this. Go out, Coop. I apologize. And if somebody has metabolic alkalosis, one of the respiratory compensatory phenomenon that can be observed is this decrease in respiratory rate, right? In general, as I mentioned, respiratory compensatory mechanisms are less. They only come into play when renal mechanisms essentially have failed. Okay. And then we're out of time, guys. So you can kind of go through the rest of these slides, just go through, expand on those concepts we were just discussing when it comes to acidosis and alkalosis. Okay.